My own son and his wife tried to steal the company I built from nothing, thinking I was just a frail old woman who wouldn't notice millions of dollars disappearing from right under my nose. They smiled to my face while they isolated me, replaced my loyal staff, and systematically drained my life's work to cover up his own catastrophic failures. But they made a critical mistake. They forgot I'm the one who taught them how to play the game, and they had no idea I was setting a trap that would end in their total and complete public humiliation. You know, when you build something from the ground up, you develop a certain instinct for it. My company, Reynolds Advisory, it's not just a name on a building in Manhattan. It's the sum of my life's work, my grit, my intuition. And for the past 6 months, my intuition had been screaming at me that something was deeply wrong. It all came to a head during one of our Sunday brunches. From my penthouse on the 72nd floor, Central Park, looks like a perfect green carpet rolled out for the gods. It's a view you pay for not just with money, but with ambition. I've always felt a kinship with that view, a piece of nature tamed and structured by sheer will. At 68, I like to think I still have that same contained energy. I keep my silver hair in a sharp bob, and I know my eyes, the color of a winter sky, don't miss much. That day, I was watching my son, James. He was holding court by the windows, the light catching the face of his Patek Philippe watch. He was explaining some market theory to a junior associate from the firm, and his voice was just a little too loud, his arguments a little too certain. It's the kind of performance people give when they're trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. His wife, Victoria, was playing her part perfectly, gliding through the room in cream silk. She'd offer mimosas with a smile as bright and hard as the Cartier bracelet on her wrist. But every so often, her eyes would flick towards James, and I'd see it, a flash of pure, undiluted anxiety under all that social polish. On the surface, they were the golden couple, the future of my firm. But I could sense this frantic energy humming just beneath their skin, a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of their lives. James finally broke away from his little audience and came over to me, putting a hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but it felt more like an anchor, possessive. He told me I shouldn't be tiring myself out with these things, that he and Victoria could handle the hosting. I remember my reply was dry, telling him that entertaining in my own home was hardly a strenuous activity. That's when Victoria moved in, seamless as ever. She placed a perfectly chilled glass in my hand, her voice all smooth concern. She said they were just worried that they thought it was time for me to relax and let them take on more of the burden. And then came the pivot. She mentioned the firm's quarterly charity donations and produced a sleek leather folder from the sideboard. She explained it was just preliminary paperwork for foundation grants, a standard procedure. If I just signed the authorization now, she said she could have it all filed first thing in the morning. I looked at the folder, then at her immaculate smiling face. As the COO, expanding our philanthropic footprint was part of her job. The request was on its face completely logical, but it felt staged. Every word, every gesture felt rehearsed, like a strategic move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. For a moment, I thought about refusing, about asking to review it in the office on Monday, but I knew how that would look. Paranoid, cantankerous, an old woman losing her grip. So I nodded. I took my Mont Blanc pen, the one my late husband gave me, and I signed the pages where her perfectly manicured finger pointed. It was just a signature, an act of trust I'd done 1,000 times before. But as the ink dried, a cold weight settled in my stomach. This one felt different. It felt heavier. Later, after the last of the guests had departed in a cloud of expensive perfume and air kisses, I retreated to my study. The quiet hum of the city is usually a comfort to me, a familiar lullaby. But as I reached for the doorknob, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear James's voice from the hallway. All the earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a low, strained hiss. I heard him ask if I had signed it. Victoria's reply was a tight whisper, confirming that I had. But then her voice sharpened. She said it wasn't enough that some man had called again. She said a final payment was due by the end of the quarter, or the entire arrangement would collapse. Her voice trembled as she listed what was at stake: the houses, the club memberships, everything. Then I heard my son's voice crack with a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. He snapped that he knew that telling her to just give him time, that he'd find the rest, he just needed more time. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over the cold brass of the doorknob. The words hung in the air, disjointed and terrifying. That man. The final payment. The arrangement collapses. That wasn't the language of philanthropy. It was the language of debt collectors, of desperate deals made in shadows. It was the language of ruin. And in that horrifying instant, everything clicked into place. The frantic energy, the forced smiles, the possessive concern. The document I had just signed wasn't a grant authorization. It was a key. And I had just willingly handed it over to the two thieves who were already living in my house. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of icy calm. The shock from that Sunday evening had frozen into something hard and sharp inside my chest. All the love and trust I'd had for my son had been replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I went to the office on Monday and acted as if nothing had happened. I smiled. I greeted my staff. I went through the motions. But all the while I was planning my first move. My son and his wife thought I was a relic, a figurehead to be managed. They were about to find out that I was the founder of this company for a reason. By Tuesday morning, I was ready. I'd called a senior management meeting under the pretense of reviewing the third quarter projections. The boardroom felt like a vault when I walked in, all polished mahogany and pressurized silence. James sat at my right hand, trying to radiate a calm he clearly didn't feel. It was a good performance, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Across the table, Victoria was a study in corporate efficiency. Her posture perfect, her laptop open, as if she were preparing for a normal day of business. They wore their deceit like bespoke suits, perfectly tailored and expensive. They were good. I had to give them that. But every tailor leaves a stray thread. I let our CFO drone on about revenue streams for a full 20 minutes. I didn't really listen to the numbers. I already knew them by heart. Instead, I watched them. I observed the way Victoria's fingers were just a little too tight on her mouse, the way James's leg bounced ever so slightly under the table. They were a team bound by a shared secret anxiety. When the CFO finally finished, I didn't move on to the next item on the agenda. I let the silence settle for a moment, then turned my gaze toward Victoria. I kept my voice deceptively mild, the way you would when asking a simple, harmless question. I told her I was reviewing the philanthropic budget the night before, and that a particular grant had caught my eye, the one for the New Century Children's Fund. I said it sounded like a very worthy cause, but that I wasn't familiar with it. I mentioned that I'd tried to look it up, but oddly, it seemed to have no public presence at all. I ended by asking with a smile if it was one of those discreet charities for high net worth donors. It was a surgical strike, and it hit its mark. For just a fraction of a second, Victoria's composure fractured. I saw a barely perceptible tightening around her mouth before she smoothed it over. She explained that it was a new initiative, very exclusive. We were a founding partner, she said, and their public launch wasn't until next year. Her voice was a model of practiced calm, claiming they wanted to get in on the ground floor. I murmured something about how proactive that was. Then I swiveled my chair just slightly to face my son. I told him that since he must have vetted the organization, I was hoping he could give me the name of their chairman. I'd love to send him a personal note, I said. James went pale. He shot a desperate look at his wife, but Victoria was suddenly fascinated by her laptop screen, refusing to meet his gaze. She had left him completely exposed. I watched as the smooth, confident CEO in waiting persona dissolved into panicked hesitation. He stammered that the chairman was a European fellow, very private. The name he finally managed to get out was Martin Schiller. I nodded thoughtfully, as if filing the name away. Then I turned back to Victoria. I casually mentioned that I thought she had said their parent organization was based in Switzerland. That's when she made her mistake. She corrected me too quickly, a flash of irritation in her eyes. It was Delaware, actually, she snapped for tax purposes. Delaware, of course. I let the words hang in the air, the silence stretching for a beat too long. A European charity run by a German but registered in Delaware for tax purposes. It was amateurish. It was desperate. The other executives in the room began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a private storm was brewing. I saw it all, the flicker of raw panic in my son's eyes, the rigid set of Victoria's jaw. My probe had found the wound. That afternoon, I locked my office door. My hands were perfectly steady as I dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. I told him it was Catherine Reynolds and that I needed his help. It was about my son. Arthur Vance had been my lawyer and my confidant for 40 years. He was a man whose discretion was as legendary as his legal mind. He listened without a single interruption as I told him everything: the tense conversation in the boardroom, the document I'd signed, the panicked words I'd overheard in the hallway. I finished by saying I was sending him a copy of the authorization I'd signed, and I needed him to find out what the New Century Children's Fund really was. He told me to consider it done. His voice a gravelly comfort. But then he gave me a warning. He told me to be careful because desperate people are dangerous. His words proved prophetic. The very next morning, my executive assistant, a wonderful young woman who had been with me for a decade, was abruptly reassigned. Victoria explained it to me with a saccharine smile, saying they felt she was overworked and that this was a little thank you for her years of service. She then introduced me to a new, impossibly cheerful assistant who seemed to shadow my every move. It was a polite corporate execution. They were cutting me off, severing my established lines of communication one by one. That evening, my personal driver of 20 years was replaced. The new car service, they explained, had updated insurance protocols. That night, James insisted on stopping by the penthouse to check on me, his presence cloying and watchful. The gilded cage I lived in was shrinking. The locks were being changed. They weren't just stealing my money. They were systematically trying to erase me, to render me a helpless, smiling figurehead in my own life, while they plundered my kingdom. And in that chilling moment, I realized this was no longer just about money. This was about survival. If you're going to hunt a predator, you can't charge in head-on. You have to learn its habits, its weaknesses, and most importantly, you have to make it underestimate you. After they replaced my driver, I knew I was being hunted, so I decided to become the perfect prey. For the next 2 weeks, I became the very picture of a matriarch in elegant decline. In meetings, I'd feign forgetfulness, asking for simple details to be repeated. I complained of a sudden deep fatigue leaving the office early most days and allowing James to chair the important afternoon sessions. I even cultivated a slight theatrical tremor in my hand when I poured tea, a little touch of vulnerability that seemed to both satisfy and reassure them. From their point of view, my brief flash of anger in the boardroom had been the last spark from a dying fire. They believed it was safely extinguished. They believed they had won. And that belief made them careless. So wonderfully, arrogantly careless. I'd see sensitive financial documents left out on their desks. I'd walk by their offices and hear them on the phone, their voices hushed, but still audible, making arrangements and moving money with the kind of brazen confidence that only comes when you believe no one is watching. They thought I was at home resting my frail old bones. In reality, I was in my study, my mind a whirlwind of strategic planning. My first move was to fight their modern treachery with modern tools. I reached out to my grandnephew, a tech genius in San Francisco, through an old private email account. Within days, a discreet IT expert he'd recommended came to my penthouse disguised as a home theater technician. He installed mirroring software on the firm's servers, routing copies of every key financial transfer, every internal email, directly to a secure off-site cloud account that only Arthur and I could access. While I was building my web, the full sordid truth of my son's desperation was playing out across town. I didn't know the specifics then, but Arthur's investigation later filled in the horrifying details. One rainy Thursday, James didn't drive to his lavish Connecticut home. He went to a sterile, anonymous office building in a part of the city he would never admit to visiting. He was there to meet the man who had sold him a dream of outshining me. In reality, this visionary investor was nothing more than a polished predator, and his exclusive offshore fund was a classic Ponzi scheme that had finally, inevitably imploded. The man's charming smile was gone, replaced by a cold reptilian focus. He told James that the other investors were getting litigious, that they'd lost everything. He was liquidating what he could to disappear, and James's final payment was his exit strategy. He made the threat clear if he didn't get the money by the end of the month, his sudden amnesia about his client list might miraculously cure itself when the SEC came knocking. And James's name, he'd said with a chilling smile, was right at the top of that list. That was the truth of it. My son wasn't just facing financial ruin. He was facing public disgrace and federal prison. He left that meeting in a cold sweat, the shame of physical weight in his chest. He had wanted so badly to build his own legacy, to finally step out from under my shadow. Instead, he'd gambled away his entire future on the empty words of a con man. The embezzlement wasn't a scheme to get rich. It was a frantic, panicked attempt to plug a hole in a sinking ship. He was just trying to borrow from the company to fix his colossal mistake before I, the one person whose judgment he feared above all others, found out. He wasn't a master criminal. He was a terrified child who had broken his mother's most expensive vase and was now trying to glue the shattered pieces back together before she got home. Back in my penthouse, I didn't know about the vase, only that my house was being robbed. The files Arthur was compiling were a roadmap of their betrayal. The New Century Children's Fund was exactly what we thought a shell corporation in Delaware. It was designed to funnel money to another shell in the Cayman Islands, which then dispersed the funds to a series of personal accounts. One of those accounts belonged to James. The document I had signed, the one for a charitable donation, had authorized the transfer of $3 million. While James and Victoria were celebrating what they thought was their final victory, even planning a lavish trip to St. Bart's, I was preparing for war. I went into my archives and found the original hard copy blueprints of our office building, locating the exact placement of the server rooms, and more importantly, the blind spots in the security camera coverage. Then I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I went to a different bank, a small old institution, where I still kept a safe deposit box from before James took over my day-to-day finances. I used the spare key my husband had left me, a relic of a bygone era. Inside, resting on black velvet, were the bearer bonds he'd insisted I keep as an untraceable emergency fund. The old ways, the ones my son had called outdated, were about to become his undoing. He had made a critical mistake. He had looked at me and seen only an old woman he needed to manage. He had forgotten I was a titan, and titans know exactly how to weather a storm. For weeks, I had been the spider patiently spinning my web. I watched the data from the server mirror pile up each email and wire transfer another thread. Arthur's forensic accountants worked in silence, tracing the flow of money through the labyrinth of shell corporations. We had everything. The evidence was irrefutable. The only question left was when and how to strike. The con man's deadline was approaching, which meant James's desperation would be at its peak. It was time. The plan we devised was not for a quiet conversation, but for a controlled demolition. I would not be in the room for the initial blast. Arthur would be my proxy. I sat in my study, a small, high-resolution monitor in front of me, displaying a live feed from a microcamera, disguised as a lapel pin on Arthur's suit. My heart was a cold, steady drum in my chest. The earthquake began not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined footsteps of a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. I watched on the screen as Arthur Vance walked into the main reception area of Reynolds Advisory at precisely 11:02 a.m. on a Wednesday. He carried a slim leather briefcase and an air of absolute, unshakable authority that I had relied on for 40 years. He didn't stop at the front desk. He walked directly to the glass doors of the main conference room. Inside, my son James was in the middle of a presentation to 3 of our firm's most important clients. I watched Arthur open the door without knocking. His voice was calm, but through the tiny microphone, it carried the undeniable weight of a court order. He simply said James's name and that they needed to talk. Now, on the screen, I saw my son freeze mid-sentence, the blood draining from his face. The clients looked on their expressions shifting from polite interest to confusion. Victoria, standing by the presentation screen, took a step forward, her voice brittle with a false authority she no longer possessed. She was sorry, she said, but Mr. Reynolds was in a meeting and he would have to make an appointment. Arthur's reply was devastatingly calm. His appointment, he said, was with the truth, and it was long overdue. He placed his briefcase on the polished table. Then he looked directly at the clients, his expression one of polite, professional regret. He apologized for the interruption, introduced himself as my personal counsel, and informed them that the meeting was adjourned. The reason, he stated, was that there appeared to be a matter of significant financial malfeasance at the firm that required their immediate attention. The word malfeasance detonated in the quiet room. It's a word that in our world is more shocking than any curse. I watched the clients exchange alarmed glances, gathering their papers with a palpable sense of urgency. They were out of the room in under a minute. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, James's carefully constructed facade crumbled into dust. He turned on Arthur, stammering, asking what this was, what he had done. Arthur's voice was like ice. The question he countered was what had he done? He opened his briefcase. He didn't pull out a sheaf of legal papers. He pulled out a single high-resolution photograph and slid it across the table. It was a satellite image of a barren, scrubby plot of land in the Cayman Islands. This, Arthur said, was the headquarters of the New Century Children's Fund. Not quite the bustling philanthropic hub he'd described. Then came the second blow. Arthur produced another document, a bank statement from the Delaware Shell Corporation. It clearly showed a $3 million transfer from Reynolds Advisory. It was followed by another transfer for $2.5 million into a personal account. An account in the name of James Reynolds. Through the camera, I saw Victoria gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. I saw the fight go out of her. It was over, all of it. My son just stared at the statement, his chest heaving. The walls of his life, so carefully built on my foundation, were dissolving around him. The lies, the justifications, the desperate, frantic hope that he could fix it all before I found out it was all gone, incinerated by the stark, undeniable proof of his failure. His voice when he spoke was a whisper. He said that Arthur didn't understand. He sank into one of the expensive leather chairs, his head in his hands, and he began to break. The confident executive I had watched hold court at brunch was gone. In his place was a broken man. He confessed that he'd lost everything. He'd invested his entire trust fund, all of it, in a scam. A con artist, he whispered, had taken it all. The confession came out in a raw, shameful torrent of panic. He told Arthur everything: the charismatic sales pitch, the intoxicating promise of finally outshining his mother, the dizzying, catastrophic loss, the threatening calls from the con man, and underneath it all, the crushing, unbearable fear of me finding out he was a fool. He sobbed tears I could see even on the small screen streaming down his face, swearing he was going to pay it back, that he was just borrowing it. He just needed to stop the man from telling everyone, from telling me. Victoria, who had been frozen in a state of shock, suddenly erupted. The terror in her eyes curdled into a vicious, cornered fury. She shrieked at him, accusing him of lying to her, of telling her it was a bridge loan, a liquidity issue. She screamed, asking if he'd lost her money, too. She called him a pathetic, weak-willed idiot. Their conspiracy, born of a shared, desperate secret, fractured instantly under the weight of the truth, dissolving into a firestorm of blame and recrimination. They were no longer partners in crime. They were just two drowning people trying to push the other one under to get a final gulp of air. I had seen enough. I turned off the monitor, stood up, and walked out of my study. I walked down the hall, my steps measured and calm. I pushed open the conference room door. My presence silenced them immediately. They both turned to look at me, their faces a mask of shock and horror. James looked up from his chair, his face streaked with tears, his eyes pleading. The one person in the world whose judgment he had feared most was now standing before him, the final arbiter of his ruined life. I looked at my son, and I felt no triumph, only a profound, weary sorrow. I wasn't a CEO assessing a liability. I was a mother witnessing a self-inflicted wound of catastrophic proportions. My voice, when I finally spoke, was quiet but absolute. I was no longer the frail, forgetful woman from their little play. I was the founder. I was the matriarch. I was the titan, and I was back in control. I told them what was going to happen next. I looked from my son to his wife, my gaze sweeping over them, leaving them powerless and terrified in my wake. There would be an emergency board meeting the next morning at 9 o'clock. They would both be there, and they, I said, would tell the board everything. I was no longer a victim seeking justice. I was a leader dictating the non-negotiable terms of their surrender. The power had shifted completely and irrevocably. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my study, the city lights spread out beneath me like a blanket of fallen stars, and I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just a business decision. It was the amputation of a part of my own life. But the cancer of their deceit was too deep, and the only way to save the body, my company, my legacy, was to cut it out completely. There was a profound sadness in it, a grief for the son I thought I had, but there was no hesitation. By morning, the grief had been packed away, replaced by the cold, clear resolve of a founder about to save her life's work. I entered the main boardroom at precisely 9 a.m. Arthur Vance was at my side, a silent, formidable presence. The air in the room was thick with a tension you could almost taste. The 6 board members, men and women of industry I had known and respected for decades, sat with grim expressions, their usual morning pleasantries replaced by low murmuring tones. At the far end of the long mahogany table, James and Victoria sat in a state of suspended animation. They were isolated, pale, and utterly defeated. They looked like defendants in a trial that had already reached its inevitable damning verdict. I didn't take my usual seat at the head of the table. That chair represented a role they had tried to strip from me. Instead, I stood before them all in the center of the room, a projector screen humming to life behind me. I was not there as a mother seeking sympathy or a victim demanding pity. I was there as the founder and majority shareholder of Reynolds Advisory. I was there to reclaim my throne. My voice, when I spoke, was steady and clear, resonating with an authority no one in that room had heard from me in months. I thanked them for coming on such short notice. I told them I had called the meeting to address a cancer that had infected the very heart of our firm. A betrayal, I said, not just of trust, but of the fundamental principles of integrity upon which Reynolds Advisory was built. I clicked the remote in my hand. The first slide appeared. It was a high-resolution scan of the fraudulent grant authorization I had signed. I explained that this document, which I was deceptively led to believe was for a charitable donation, had authorized the transfer of $3 million from our corporate accounts. Click. The next slide showed the logoless generic letterhead of the New Century Children's Fund, a ghost company. Click. The Delaware incorporation papers for the shell company registered to a post office box. Click. The offshore bank statements from the Cayman Islands showing the money flowing in and then flowing right back out. With each slide, I systematically and dispassionately laid out the entire conspiracy. I presented the evidence with the cool, detached precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. There were no theatrics, no emotional appeals. It was just a cold, hard cascade of fax wire transfers, laundered funds, and falsified reports, all meticulously documented by Arthur's team. When the final slide showed the $2.5 million transfer into a personal account bearing my son's name, I let the image hang in the silence. Then I finally looked away from the screen, my gaze settling on my son. I stated my voice, leaving no room for doubt that these actions were carried out by James Reynolds and his wife Victoria. A collective gasp went through the room. The board members, my old friends and colleagues, stared at James, their expressions hardening into a mixture of shock and utter disgust. But then I did something they didn't expect. I softened my voice just almost imperceptibly. I told them that the question was why. It was not, as they might assume, a simple case of greed. It was, I explained, an attempt to cover a catastrophic personal financial failure. I didn't need to present evidence for this part. The proof was sitting right in front of them, a hollowed-out shell of a man. I looked directly at James. My voice was not a request. It was a command. I told him to tell them. It was, I know, the cruelest and most perfect part of my plan. His judgment wouldn't come from me. It would come from the very people he had spent his entire life trying and failing to impress. Stripped of every last defense, James pushed himself to his feet. His body trembled, his expensive suit hanging on him like a costume he no longer had the right to wear. In a halting, broken voice, he confessed everything. He told them about the reckless investment, the charismatic charlatan who had duped him, the Ponzi scheme, the crushing debt, and the desperate, foolish cover-up that followed. He admitted to embezzling the $3 million not for a lavish trip or a new car, but to pay off the con man who was threatening him with exposure and federal prison. When he finally finished and collapsed back into his chair, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The condemnation was palpable. But it wasn't the fiery rage of betrayed business partners. It was something far worse. It was the quiet, dismissive pity of powerful men for a weak and foolish one. That judgment, that soul-crushing pity, would be a more profound and lasting punishment for my son than any prison sentence could ever be. In that moment, his entire identity, so carefully constructed on the illusion of competence and success, was publicly and irrevocably annihilated. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, letting the weight of their judgment settle upon him. Then I delivered the consequences. They were not cruel, but they were absolute. Effective immediately, I announced James Reynolds was removed as CEO, and his employment with the firm was terminated. Victoria Reynolds was likewise terminated. They would, of course, be required to make full financial restitution for every dollar they had stolen. But I concluded I would not be pressing criminal charges. The public disgrace they had brought upon themselves right here in this room was a life sentence of its own kind. Then I turned to the board. I announced that I would be resuming my duties as active CEO. I informed them that Arthur was already initiating a full independent audit to assure them and our clients that the ROT had been contained and completely cut out. Reynolds Advisory, I reminded them, was built on integrity. And as long as I was there, it would continue to operate on that unwavering principle. It was over. I had not just reclaimed my company, I had reinforced its very foundation. I had served a justice that was as complex and devastating as the betrayal itself, leaving my son and his wife to drown in the consequences of their own desperate, foolish choices. After the board meeting, James and Victoria simply walked out of the room and out of my life. The aftermath of that public reckoning was as swift as it was brutal. The world they had built on a foundation of my money and their lies crumbled overnight. News travels fast in the high-pressure ecosystem of Manhattan finance, and failure, especially failure, born of such foolishness, is a contagion no one wants to catch. Their club memberships were quietly revoked. The invitations to society galas and charity fundraisers simply stopped arriving. Friends who had once eagerly accepted their lavish hospitality, who had laughed at my son's jokes and admired my daughter-in-law's style, now crossed the street to avoid them. They were ghosts in a city that only values presence and success. The financial collapse was just as total. They were forced to sell their sprawling Connecticut estate and the pristine Hamptons beach house just to begin paying back the $3 million they owed the firm. It was a debt that would shadow them for the rest of their lives, a constant crushing reminder of their greed and desperation. The weight of this new reality, I learned through Arthur, affected them very differently. Victoria, stripped of the status and wealth that had been the cornerstones of her identity, became a creature of pure, undiluted bitterness. She blamed James for his weakness, me for my cruelty, and the world for its fundamental unfairness. She refused to acknowledge her own complicity in the scheme, retreating into a state of resentful denial where she was the perpetual victim. Their marriage, already fractured by deceit, could not survive the impact of public disgrace. It dissolved within a few months, another casualty of their shared failure. James, however, took a different path. Hitting rock bottom with such force shattered the fragile pride that had been both his driving motivation and his greatest flaw. With nothing left to lose, no image left to maintain, he began a slow, agonizing journey toward accountability. He started attending therapy, finally confronting the lifelong pressure of living under my legacy and the crippling fear of inadequacy that had led him to make such a catastrophic mistake in the first place. It was a painful, unglamorous process, and I knew there was no guarantee of redemption. But for the first time in his life, he was being truly honest with himself. While their world imploded, mine began to expand again. Resuming my role as CEO of Reynolds Advisory felt like coming home. I moved with a renewed sense of purpose, my mind sharp and clear. One of my first acts was to promote a brilliant, hungry young analyst from within the firm to be my new COO, my second in command. She was a woman who reminded me of myself 30 years ago, and in mentoring her, I found a new kind of joy. Together, we restored the firm's reputation with our characteristic blend of integrity and strategic brilliance, proving to our clients and the entire industry that the rot had indeed been excised. I was working not with the frantic energy of someone trying to build a legacy, but with the calm, focused wisdom of someone securing one. I was no longer just a titan of industry. I was a survivor, and that strength brought me a profound sense of peace. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected. I traveled. I found joy in the simple, quiet act of living a life unburdened by deceit and suspicion. 6 months passed like this. 6 months of quiet rebuilding and newfound freedom. Then one afternoon, as I was in my office, looking out over the city, watching the sun set and paint the sky in shades of orange and violet, my new assistant buzzed me. She told me a Mr. Reynolds was on line 1 for me and that he said it was personal. For a moment, I hesitated, but the war was over. I picked up the receiver. I said hello to James. His voice on the other end was quiet, stripped of all its old bravado and false confidence. He stammered a little at first, then found his words. He just wanted to say he told me that he was sorry for everything. He knew it wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but he needed me to hear it. I listened, and I believed him. I said softly that I heard him. There was no warmth in my voice, but there was no malice either. It was the detached acknowledgement of a truth that had finally been spoken. Forgiveness was not on the table, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some betrayals cut too deep. But his apology was a necessary final step. I ended the call and turned back to my window. The lights of the city were beginning to sparkle, a vast constellation of ambition and power. I had built a part of that world, I had nearly lost it, and I had taken it back. The betrayal had cost me a son, the son I thought I had. But in a strange, painful way, it had given me back myself. I was Catherine Reynolds, the founder of Reynolds Advisory, and I was standing strong and independent in the heart of my kingdom. My pain had been transformed into a hard-won, unshakable wisdom. The consequences my son and his wife faced were a lasting reality they had created for themselves. But my new reality, the one I had fought for, was one of peace, purpose, and absolute freedom. Catherine's story shows us that betrayal, even when born from desperation, must still be met with strength. Her son wasn't driven by simple greed, but by a deep-seated fear of failure and the crushing weight of shame. Yet understanding his pain did not excuse his actions. True justice, as she demonstrated, is not about inflicting cruelty. It's about restoring order with clarity and precision. It's about protecting the life you have built, even when it means making a painful, necessary cut. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the clearest, and finding your own peace requires letting others face the reality they created.